Dr. Delavore, you can start now.
Okay. Good day, everybody. This is my great pleasure to start a webinar series by ISPRS Technical Group 4, Working Group 3 today. Actually, we have 3 speakers, 3 panelists with us, including Professor Michael Goodchild, Emeritus Professor of the University of California in Santa Barbara, who is a member of National Academy of Science and former member of Royal Society of Canada, member of American Academy of Arts and Science, and former member of Royal Society and corresponding author and the editor of Geographical Analysis and Methods and Models and Geographic Information Science and the Annals of Association of American Geographers. Professor Goodchild published 15 books and 550 articles, and he was the chair of National Research Council Mapping Science Committee and the National Science Foundation Advisory Committee on Social Behavior and Economic Sciences. His current research interests are in geoscience, including spatial analysis and uncertainty in geographic data. And he will discuss about ethical issues in spatial data analysis. The next speaker would be Professor Alfred Stein from the University of Twente, and his research interests are in spatial statistics and image analysis, spatial aspect of spatial and spatiotemporal data, land use hazards, disasters, and spatial health. He discussed about the publishing advances in spatial data quality. And the third speaker would be Dr. Gerard Navratil, senior scientist at Technical University of Vienna and member of Austrian Standard Committee of Geographic Information and Surveying, and the Australian delegate to ISO. He is also acting editor of Geoinformatica and is a member of editorial board of Spatial Statistics. He has written 5 books and more than 140 articles, and his research interests concentrate on spatial data quality and the processes linked to this with respect to application of land administration and navigation. And I'm Mahmoud Reza Delavar from chair of ISPRS Working Group 3 and from University of Tehran. Okay, next slide, please. Actually, I will give an introduction to this webinar and then ask the other panelists to discuss. We are at the age of ubiquitous GIS and big spatial data initiatives, where it's important to know the right data at right place and time, and network and service to the right people, and also considering the context awareness and the preferences of the users. In addition, we are at the era of big spatial data and mining, which provides some opportunities and challenges for the spatial data quality and uncertainty. Here we have a report from UN Geospatial Group on Information Management published in 2020, which is the 3rd report about the future trends in geospatial information management from the 5 to 10 minutes vision. Here we can see the cross-reference of the drivers and trends. In terms of drivers, we have new sources of data, analytical methods, including the integration and interoperability, multiple data sources, new opportunities in data gathering, crowdsourcing and VGI, high resolution image, remote sensing image, big data processing and licensing harmonization, digital platforms and linked data. In terms of technological advancement, we are dealing with ubiquitous connectivity, digital infrastructure, intelligent mobility, digital twins, edge computing, visualization, and immersive technology, the visualization, augmented reality, virtual reality, and their integration, machine learning, deep learning, and artificial intelligence, data cubes, and quantum computing. In evolution of the user requirement, we have the rise of urban environment, real-time information, digital divide, and also in terms of positioning, we have indoor, outdoor, and integrated positioning, seamless positioning. And we have seen a lot of research on a smart city. In terms of industrial structural shift, we are dealing with diversity of the work and technologies, talent and consumer shift, incubator spaces, regeneration of business ecosystem, and new consolidation agreement, collaboration agreement, And in terms of legislation environment, we are dealing with digital ethics and privacy, cybersecurity, pace of digital and technical change, and also pressure on government institutions. In addition, we are dealing with a number of taxonomies and theories in spatial data handling and uncertainty assessment. The taxonomy provided by Professor Peter Fisher, by Professor Warboys and Dugham, by Dr. Tawana, and also Professor Shi, and a range of data fusion theories, including game theory, OWA, Shannon entropy, AHP, ANP, Dempsey-Schaeffer theory of evidence, fuzzy logic, ANN, ANFIS, Robset theory, and granular computing. So the uncertainty in new terminologies we are facing in GI community, new terminologies like building information management, knowledge-based SCI, spatial email government, land administration, smart cities, age and disabled decision support system, geosimulation, ITS and driverless cars, spatial cognition, ambient intelligence, VR, AR, and immersive technologies, and also in terms of seamless positioning, indoor, outdoor, and seamless. And in addition, we have get to the era of Industry 4, covering the smart integration of artificial intelligence, IoT, machine-to-machine communication, automation without the need for human intervention. Our community has faced some achievement with respect to SDQ and uncertainty modeling. Users get more aware about the spatial data quality. We have seen National Center for Geographic Information Analysis, which established by Professor Goodchild in 1988. SDQ term is in AGI as one example, and Berkeley Initiative on Soft Computing, BISC, more steps toward standardization issues, like what we have seen in ISO, FGDC, CN, OGC, and the American National Standard of Spatial Data Transfer Standard. A number of conferences devoted to spatial data quality, especially ISSTQ and spatial accuracy. We have seen a number of increasing journals devoted to STQ or covering terms of STQ terms, spatial data quality, including IJGIS, Geoinformatica, Spatial Statistics, that Professor Stein will discuss about that, fuzzy set theory and systems, International Journal of Approximate Reasoning, International Journal of Uncertainty, Fuzziness, and Knowledge-Based System, Geoinformatics, Geostatistics, and ISPRS IAGI, and a number of commercial and academic developments in error-aware GIS, including Professor Barrow development of intelligent GIS in 1992, Data Uncertainty Engine by Professor Hugh Welling, Edrisi. In terms of challenges, we are faced with a range of taxonomies and standards, a divide between the users and producers' perspective, less attention to the process-based models, and the problem with spatial data mining and big data mining without the checking of errors in raw data. There is a gap in geospatial ontology, between ontology, epistemology, and teleology in spatial data quality, improper communication, visualization of uncertainty in remote sensing and GIS analysis, challenges in spatial data and services and usability for GI community, and the shift between data quality and law, liability issues, which Professor Goodchild will discuss about that today, and risk-based data quality assessment needs further investigations. In addition, in the work of Lunita et al. In 1991, a special issue on photogrammetric engineering and remote sensing, we have seen a number of errors in remote sensing and GIS integration from different flow of data acquisition to the implementation. Quality of services needs to be further investigated, the impact of data quality on decision-making, legal aspect, meta-uncertainty issues, development of integrated terminology and taxonomy, the comparison between professional and volunteer spatial data and their integration, ontology and interoperability issues, ubiquitous applications, error-aware GIS, uncertainty in SDI and land administration and modeling, errors in GIS. We have seen some future research initiatives, including the widespread use of spatial and spatial temporal data and data mining, quality of UBGI and GSSN, new data sources of laser scanning and radar data acquisitions, multi-concept remote sensing and GIS, new applications in GIS transportation, health, urban planning, more focus on quality of real-time and on-demand mapping, a number of research on artificial intelligence and expert system in GI data acquisitions, more challenges on semantics and interoperability of data, more development in positioning issues, and also a number of research on spatial data decision support system, spatial data infrastructure, land administration and land management. Some focus on food security and poverty reductions are concerned. More work on quality of spatial temporal modeling and simulation is needed, and the need for global reputation and cooperations in terms of national security and privacy issues, and the reliability and usefulness of GIS services and full integration with e-government, mobile government, and ubiquitous government. We are dealing with a number of high-resolution global data like DEMs produced by the reliability of for the intended use should be considered, and more rapid and lower cost of data processing techniques need to be investigated. And lastly, more cooperation, competence, and challenges among public, private, and NGOs in GI data collection and services are required. More unification and cooperation, unification and coordination of GI policy throughout the world, like what UN GGIM initiative is doing. More research on spatial temporal geostatistics method are required and to train toward decision-making and multi-criteria decision-making. More research on qualitative reasoning and integration of qualitative and quantitative reasoning in GIS, and also conventional expert data fusion algorithms in homogeneous and heterogeneous GI environment should be assessed. Thank you very much. I now invite Professor Goodchild to start his keynote speech, please.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for that very remarkable illustration of how large this field is and how many different directions there are and how many challenges there are in it. I'm going to add one more, unfortunately. I'm going to suggest that the field is even more complex and growing more complex than we might have thought some years ago. And the reason for that is what I'm going to call ethics, which is in itself a very large topic, but is something that I think I'm going to argue is increasingly important in what we do. I'm going to do that by discussing first some of the ethical issues which I think arise in spatial data analysis, and then talk in some detail about a couple of issues which are very close to my heart and very much, I think, part of my own research. So let me start with the biggest version of this, the most expansive version, which is to ask this question: why do we do what we do? And I think our answer to that, maybe a decade ago, would have been very simple. We do what we do because we are driven by curiosity, because we see problems that need to be addressed that fall into our area of interest. And I think that has always been sufficient and satisfactory. We've measured our progress by referee journal articles and by additions to knowledge in general. But I think what has happened just recently in the last couple of years is the addition of something quite different, which I will summarize with the word ethics. But let me give you just a list of some of the issues which I think are significant. If I could get my slides to advance. There we go. What I will call a vast canvas. And in many cases, I think the ethical issue that has been most prominent in the literature has been locational privacy. The fact that collecting data on people's locations and sharing data on people's locations can invade privacy. And there have been various responses to that around the world. The European legislation is quite advanced. But I think this issue of locational privacy is something that pervades all aspects of spatial data quality. But beyond that, let's go a bit further, because besides locational privacy, I'd suggest that many of us do research involving human subjects, which raises all sorts of ethical issues of itself. Many of us draw inferences from spatial data, which may encounter ethical issues, and I'll give some illustrations of that in a few moments. Many of us deal with questions of the provenance and uncertainty of data, and I think it becomes an ethical issue when we ignore uncertainty and when we don't inquire into the provenance of data. There are ethical issues involved in the implementation of analytic results in decision-making. And today, the initials JEDI, there are many other competing acronyms, but JEDI stands for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, suggests that there are issues in the staffing of spatial data quality research which raise questions of diversity and inclusion. For example, it is very difficult to find instances of any contributions to the literature in the GI field prior to 1990, which were made by women. All of the original research in GI and the development of GIS was led by men. And it wasn't until a quarter of a century ago that women even began to be recognized for their contribution to the field. And teaching practices are another area where these issues come to the fore. So this is a vast canvas, and let me suggest that there has been a lot more recent attention to this than there has been in the past. And it leads to the biggest question, I think, which certainly to me is the biggest question, which is, why do we do what we do? Is it to advance justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, for example? How then should we prioritize these issues? Because clearly there's a vast canvas here, and it's not going to get full attention in all of its aspects. So first, let's say that some of these issues are not specific to the GI field, to geospatial infrastructure. So issues of staffing occur in every discipline. Issues of equity in teaching occur in every discipline. But at the same time, we have to say that they cannot be ignored in the current climate. So the attention to these issues is, I believe, of critical importance. And GI science can well play a role as an exemplar in showing the way how to be more equitable, how to be more inclusive in our work. And a second way to prioritize is to say that some of these issues are more closely aligned with my own interests. So I've done a lot of research over the years on uncertainty. I've also done a lot of work on the process of making inference from spatial data. And so that perhaps should lead our own way of thinking, our own way of prioritizing these issues. Underlying all of this is what I would call critical spatial thinking. And I tend to define this as what goes on in the mind of the experienced user of geospatial technology. And very specifically, what are the data not telling me about the conditions on the ground? Data are only a representation of reality. They're always missing important detail. we tend in assembling geospatial data to ignore particular scales of data. We ignore details, we generalize, we synthesize, we integrate. And so that leads then always to the question, what alternative inferences might the analysis support? What alternative theories might also explain what we're seeing? And I think, while we wouldn't normally think of this as an ethical issue, I think it is very much an ethical issue. It's very much concerned with what information, what inferences we draw from what we see. And it is, let me give you an illustration of this, which I think makes the point very clearly. So here are a couple of illustrations. This one comes from, in fact, the New York Times in late 2018, which had acquired from the commercial marketplace about 300 million pings, 300 million instances where a particular device had a known location. And it is trivial to link together all of the pings from one device because the device's IP address is known. And so here are the 8,600 pings obtained from one device over about 4 months. We assume, therefore, that this is one person, because this is probably a personal cell phone. And here are the locations that have been pinged. And from this, it is trivial to identify the person, to identify where the person lives, what the person was doing, why particular trips were being made, where the person visited a doctor, what kind of doctor it was, and therefore what the person was probably suffering from, where the person visited a boyfriend, et cetera, et cetera. So there are all sorts of inferences which can be made from what appear to be anonymous and very simple pings. It is only the fact that we have linked together a large number of pings from one device that allow us to make these kinds of inferences. So, for example, here is the home of that person. Now, this New York Times article had approached this person and asked if, in fact, she was willing to be publicized in this way, and she had agreed in order to help make the point that the New York Times was making, which is that our privacy is being invaded all the time by geospatial technology. So there's one example of some of the ethical issues which arise. Here's another. And if one were to look at the textbooks or the syllabi of typical courses in GIS and spatial analysis, this one would figure very large. This is the very famous map made by John Snow, Dr. John Snow, in 1854, following an outbreak of cholera in London. And I've regenerated it here by using an 1843 map of London, and I've superimposed the green dots, which are the locations of deaths, and I've also superimposed the red triangles, which are the locations of water sources in this area of London. Now, this we always present as a first order example of an inference that one can draw from spatial data, because it is clear that the deaths were clustered around one particular water source. It's almost buried, in fact, by the deaths in the middle of this map. And we use this to claim, rightly or wrongly, that this map played a large part in figuring out the causal mechanisms for cholera, figuring out the fact that cholera is passed through drinking water. And in fact, Dr. John Snow was able to conduct a controlled experiment, in this case, by locking the pump. And of course, the outbreak died out. My point here is a little different from the normal one, because I believe there are at least 4 processes which would explain this pattern, only one of which is the one that we tend to emphasize. So you can see this as the result of drinking water from the pump, but you can also see it as consistent with the prevailing theory at that time that cholera was passed through the air, and particularly through foul air. And the density of people living in this area of Soho created what the time was called a miasma, an area of very unpleasant air that was conducive to the transmission of cholera. That's another explanation. A third is contagion, because this outbreak is fully consistent with one original carrier of cholera being located near the pump. And there is even a fourth, which is that you are looking at a population at risk. You're looking at a distribution of perhaps a particular kind of person who is susceptible to cholera. So this is, I think, very current in the sense that this relates directly these days to COVID and the transmission of that particular infection. So the ethical issue is that we have selected one of four possible explanations. I say at least four. And we have done so in order to favor our own position that spatial data is an effective way of addressing issues of epidemiology. So there's an example of the ethics of inference. And let me suggest that this same argument can be applied quite frequently, because one thing that is inescapable about spatial data is that it is cross-sectional, and there will always be multiple processes which account for the same pattern when you look at cross-sectional data. So let me just summarize what I've been saying. I think the ethical issues create a vast canvas, a huge set of issues, which we can express, if we like, as the question, why do we do what we do? And the answer to that, I believe, is no longer as simple as it used to be. We can no longer argue that we do what we do because we are driven by curiosity, scientific curiosity, or by the need to solve particular problems. Issues of justice, equity, inclusion, and diversity also these days influence and give us reasons for doing what we do. I also have emphasized the importance of uncertainty, which leads, I believe, to a host of ethical issues. Very succinctly put, the map is not the territory. In other words, the representation that we use in GI is not reality, is not the truth. It's a selected representation of the truth. And then finally, I believe that in this field, inference drawn from spatial data must always be cautious. There are always dangers of selecting inferences that favor a particular point of view, but are not the only possible inference that we can draw. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for attending today. I hope these comments have been useful. And at that point, I will stop screen sharing and return to our host.
Thank you very much, Professor Goodchild, for your very informative presentation on ethical issues in GIS. And now I would like to move on to Professor Alfred Stein to discuss about the spatial statistics and his experience during a long term as the editor-in-chief of spatial statistics. Professor Stein, the floor is yours.
We are
Okay, there we go. No, yeah, I found the problem. That means I found the solution. I saw the problem. Thank you,
Okay.
Professor De La Var, for introducing me. I've provided an overview, in fact, of the publishing that is done in our domain over the last couple of years and some ideas for the future. And the title that I've provided to this presentation is Publishing Advances in Spatial Data Quality. I'm based in ITC, Faculty of Geoinformation Science and Earth Observation in the Department of Earth Observation Science. Let me see whether you solved the problem. Going to the next slide. Good. If I talk about ISSDQ, that means our main domain of science over the last couple of 20 years. I think that the main issue has been that we have been able to link our scientific conferences and symposia with an interesting set of publications. They both kind of moved in parallel. On the left-hand side, you see the list of meetings that were organized. It all started in Hong Kong, essentially with the work of John Shi. It's a pity that he can't be here today. I would have loved to hear his views on the topic that we are discussing. And you see that we go back to Hong Kong several times. In 2003, we were there, and we went back to Hong Kong in 2013. And in the meantime, the word spread all over the world. The last three events in Montpellier, Beijing, and Enschede were events that were organized in conjunction with the Geospatial Week. So somehow that independence has been given up, and we have become part of a larger organization, the ISPRS, which is fine. That means you have a wider outreach of whatever you are doing. That was the range of the conferences, the presentations, and on the picture you see a typical group that convened in such an event. Some 100 people, could be a bit more, could be a bit less. It varied a little bit over the years. I remember one where we were just with 30. We also remember a few in Beijing in particular that we had more than 200, but these were the typical numbers of attendance. Out of that came a long list of different publications. This is a not totally random list that I've collected over the last couple of days. One noteworthy one was, of course, the first one, Piet Fischer, the late Piet Fischer. It's a shame that he's not with us anymore. Mark Goodshot and John Shi, Spatial Data Quality in 2002. I think it followed one or two of these conferences that you just saw. That continued with the work of Andrew Frank. And then you see the whole list of publications over the years. The recurring name of John Shi is there. The recurring name of my Goodchild is there once in a while. And it's still going on. I realized that the Gupta and Morrison book is an older one, but I found that one on the 2013 as an next edition. And the same is the book of John Shi, 2020, The Principles of Modeling Uncertainties. I think that is also an older book that has come back again. Now that's only part of the output, and maybe even a more important part of the, well, not more important, but another part of the output is the papers that we can see and that we can collect in the Web of Science. So that's the next stage that I did, and that tells us a little bit more of what is being published so far. In the past, you would have done a good thing if you want to publish your paper, and that would then be recognized in the Web of Science, if you would have been making a link with remote sensing. That gave you a good chance of having your paper published. The same applies essentially to the geography and physical. These groups are kind of almost similar in terms of their output. Whereas the imaging science for the grammetry technology has 73 documents. In total, there were 235. Now, how should we interpret this? Well, what I said already, this is the past, and this is how we can look about how we, people at my age, scientists at our age, the people in the West have been publishing over the years, mainly in the West. Now, I could imagine that for the future, you look to those parts of that in Web of Science where the publications are kind of lacking. If you look carefully to this view, you see, for instance, that health is not around, to name one. So an interesting opportunity maybe is to focus a little bit on health and spatial data quality. That could be an element that is now somewhere hidden among the other categories, but it could be something where you could say, well, there's something to be gained. The same applies to something like urban science. It's of course part of geography. It is part of geography physical. It's part of remote sensing. But I could imagine that is also something that could develop in the next couple of years. You don't see anything specifically on big data. So that is also could also be an important issue to start on publishing. So if you want to define your publishing strategy for the years to come, this kind of information, this type of publications could be an interesting way ahead. I
Dr.
was not.
Stein,
Yes, please.
excuse me. We are seeing your presenter view, not the slideshow. So can you try to restart the presentation, because we are seeing the notes.
Oh, that's strange. I see the presentations very clearly. I don't have notes. I don't know what's happening. I see my presentation very clearly before me.
Are you using 2 monitors?
No. Yes, I'm using 2. Yeah, that's correct. They're connected.
Yeah. I think you have to move your PowerPoint to the other one.
Oh, I can't. No, that's impossible. The one is just a monitor connected to my laptop.
To your laptop.
But I can unlock it if you like. I don't know how to do that, but it must be possible to do that reasonably quickly. I just switch it off. You can't see my slide number 4 at the moment?
We can see the slides, but it's not just the slide. We see the slide and then on the right, it's the notes. But I think if it's quite difficult to transfer it to the slideshow, I think it should be okay. So there's an advice from our audience. So it says select this.
I'm sorry for that.
Okay.
Okay, I can black this.
Yeah, can you go to display settings at the top of your screen?
Yeah.
Yes, and then change view.
I don't have this change view. I can swap.
Can you select duplicate slideshow?
Yeah, is this it?
Yes, that's right. Thank you very much, and sorry for the interruption.
Apologies for this technical hiccup. Even after a year and a half of doing presentations, it's still a problem to do this flawlessly. Okay, so Web of Science, I think I've discussed that enough at the moment. Let me continue then. How about the publications in time? And that's also an interesting one. You see that 2013 was the big year, 44 publications in Web of Science in a single year. Now that has slowly grown. If you look to 2011, it's there, 2010, 2014, but somehow after 2016, 17, 18 becoming smaller, and it entirely almost disappeared from the top 10 years for 2019 and 2020. But luckily we see it coming back. 2021 already had 11 publications, and well, the year is only, let's say, 9 months gone, so we still have a lot of opportunities to publish for the year to come. So the publications in time show that peak, an interesting one, and also we see that the publications are coming back somehow. What are the most cited papers? I found 2. That means 2 that were clearly identified. One with 188 citations, published in the International Journal of GIS by Sinaratne, Mombashiri, Ali, Kapinjiri, Hakley, on volunteer geographic information quality assessment. I think it is a very important topic anyway. And in 327 citations were to a paper of Brown and Kita, and that was about key issues and research priority for public participation in GIS. Both, therefore, deal with GIS in relation to public participation or volunteer geographic information. Apparently, there is a tension between the seemingly straightforward and technical issue of having a strong GIS and the more personal public feeling of the quality that is in it. And I think that underlines also my good child's earlier remark that the ethical issue could be an issue that will raise a lot of attention and on which you can get a lot of citations. Let me now go to the journal that I have even more focus on, the Spatial Statistics. It is a journal that was developed in let's say about 10 years ago. It started as in ISSDQ with a successful conference in 2011. Quite a few participants, and we had a follow-up on conferences in a sense every 2 years 2021 was cancelled regretfully for obvious reasons. 2022 was not discussable by Elsevier, who is the key organizer, but Boulder 2023 will be the next event. So if you want to know more about spatial statistics as an outlet, then it could be a good opportunity for you to go to that event. At the moment, we are doing quite well. What I said, the journal was established in 2012, so next year we will be 10 years old. We will try to celebrate that. The impact factor for the first time has increased to above 2, which in our type of science is quite a high number. We receive papers from all major spatial statistical domains, and we have had a range of important special issues, and I want to underline the importance of those. Special issues, they kind of make the field, they define it, and they usually generate a lot of spin-off. The last one we had was towards spatial data science. We think that is an important development. How far we are is another story. And then you see also the other topics that we have available. Frontiers in space and spatial temporal research was quite a good one. That means with high-level scientists. One World, One Health was a good one. But all these special issues, they usually draw a lot of attention. Something maybe to think about whether we could somehow continue this work and make it slightly more focused. Now, the journal as such, it publishes articles on the theory and application of spatial and spatial temporal statistics. That's the target of the journal. So that is geostatistics, that is anything with statistical relations, statistical uncertainty, you name it. And if you go down to the second bullet, what spatial statistics concerns, it's the quantitative analysis of spatial and spatial temporal data. And in that list is specifically listed spatial data quality. I've highlighted it, I've mentioned it in red, because to my personal feeling, it is still a very important topic that on which a lot of good scientists should be working. Also, here I've been looking to the most cited paper, and it is a paper of 2012 that is on top of the list. It's my good chance paper on ensuring the quality of volunteer geographic information. And you see the list. It's a bit biased, of course, because it's the oldest. It's one of the earliest paper in the list. 2012, almost 10 years old, but still, after all those years, the most cited paper. Other papers are upcoming though. The paper Guliev, it's 2020 and already cited 21 times, so that's going fine. But that's of course a very topical concern. It's about COVID, using the spatial panel data model. Apparently very well read and downloaded and read paper. The spatial sampling remains an important issue. Machine learning approaches remains important, etc. You see the list of papers that is important. You also see that the papers to read, but you can also think for yourself, what is not on that list, and therefore what are the white spots, and how can I somehow try to come with a manuscript that makes so many citations, that spreads the word so much over the globe. So the issue or the topic for the years to come would for me be the following. We may need a specific platform for publishing scientific developments in spatial data quality. I see that as an opportunity. We don't have it. What I showed you earlier were the books and the conferences. Well, the conferences are now part of the bigger ISPRS events. At the moment, much of the presentations that are given at these ISSTQ events are at the ISPRS events and are published in scientific journals, which is fine, but it doesn't make our domain very outstanding. There's aspects of data themselves that they change, and that is important to publish. The big data, the voluntary data, the qualitative information, we have heard already a lot about that deserves to be published. Questions of accuracy, they change over time. What was important in the past is less important in the future. The applications change. We're now looking to applications that no one has been looking at for years. We're not looking to applications that we were looking for in the past. So this is also a dynamic field that is important and exciting, and in particular your own ideas can be the most important one. So that's what I like to receive from your side, and maybe that could be part of the discussion later, when you can give me your ideas on how the publishing process in spatial data quality could continue in the years to come. That's it from my side, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Professor Stein, for a very informative speech on the history of the spatial data quality publications. going to discussing about ISSDQ lasting from 1999 to 2019, the last conference. Publications in Web of Sciences and the number of books on uncertainty from 2002 to 2020. Most cited papers about the Spatial Statistics Journal and conferences, and the need to publish and to further publish research on the spatial data quality and the areas and the topics to come and dealing with. And I hope we'll have more discussions during the question and answer. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Gerard Navratil from Technical University of Vienna to present his speech, please. Gerard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can see my screen now. What I want to talk about is, we heard a lot now about statistics. I would like to show you a little bit where statistics does not really help if we deal with concrete situations and questions that we do not ask very often. The examples I will bring are from something that we know quite well from navigation, just because that's a task that we understand quite well. We see what happens, we see what works and what does not work. So this is the reason why I selected navigation. If we're talking about spatial data quality descriptions, it's quite simple to get all the parameters because there is at least one ISO standard that we can follow. We have rules how to calculate the values. The question is it really that simple? Collecting maybe, but assessing the effect of the quality is probably not. So we all know the parameters: accuracy, completeness, consistency, name them. But do they really describe always what we are interested in? For example, if we have a road network, what's easy to describe is the legal speed limit. And accuracy of that is typically 0 standard deviation because it's from the law. So it might be outdated, it might be a completely wrong value, but there is no standard deviation connected to it. But what we're interested in is not the legal speed limit. What we're interested in is the actual driving speed, and not now, but in the future when we will be there, then we would be interested in that. So how can you assess this? We did it with floating car data. So we took 2 weeks of data, collected the data, merged the different days. Of course, we took care that during the work days you have a different speed than on the weekend. So we eliminated the weekends, and then we could show the variation along each single road segment within the 24 hours. And for one of the segments, it looked like that. So in the beginning, we have, during the night, the normal speed. So that's slightly over 30 kilometers an hour. We have the morning rush hour with a significant drop. We have the afternoon rush hour, again with a significant drop. And in the evening, the driving speed again increases. Of course, this is here shown as a line, but in theory, for each point in time, that's a distribution. Because if somebody is looking for a parking lot in front of your car, he will drive slower, so you have to drive slower too. So there is a variation all along that timeline. So how can we use that? We could use it and ask Monte Carlo what that means for an optimal path. And then you may come up with something of that. So we start at the western part of the map. We want to go to the eastern part of the map. And then Monte Carlo simulation gives us 2 choices. In 60% of the time, the northern route is quicker. 40% of the time, the southern route is quicker. Unfortunately, I have to make the decision at the beginning of my route and decide which of those routes will I take. So does it really help me? If I always take the northern route, then in 60% of the cases, I will be right. I will be on the quicker route. But if I only take that route once, it may not really help me. So it's probably a good idea to deal with a situation like that if this is something that I drive every day, for example, from home to work. But if I'm a passenger in a taxi, I just have to go to one location, I have to catch my train. I'm interested not in which one is the better one, but which one should I use to catch my train? And I think it was one of the ISSDQ conferences where we had a keynote presentation by Ed Parsons, and his flight was canceled due to fog in London. So he missed the conferences, and we were sitting at the conference venues. He was sitting in his, I think it was the kitchen, giving his presentation by video call. That was the first keynote I saw as a video call. It was an interesting experience. It was 10 or 15 years ago. So he definitely was in a situation where the optimal solution did not work because that flight that he wanted to take was canceled. So this is a simple thing. We just have one parameter and we have a variation in that parameter. We also have other quality parameters like, so the easiest way is if we just derive a value and we want to know how accurate can we estimate this value. Error propagation is one of the methods. Monte Carlo simulation also works. But what about things like completeness? How does completeness affect our decision? If we have incomplete information, for example, on one-way streets, how does that influence the route? Alenka Poplin dealt with that problem in her, or used the example in her PhD. So she started here at the top right, northeastern corner. She wanted to go to the southwest. So the green line is the optimal route if we have all information on one-way streets. If we only have a specific percentage of the one-way streets correctly, then we may start moving in a completely different direction. And as we navigate, we find out that we cannot implement the route. So we may go, for example, the blue line where we have to turn around at one point, go back where we came from, because the only other way would be to go back to the start. So we get imperfect results, we get suboptimal routes. Or we have increased costs for our decisions because we made a bad decision, moving into the wrong direction. The same goes if we use old data. Typically, we do not know what the situation currently is. We use data that was collected sometime in the past, and we assume that this is still a good approximation of the current situation. So what we did is we looked at the street network for Vienna and took snapshots for several years between 2014 and 2020. And the year 2020 was seen as the ground truth. So we assumed, okay, this is the current situation to eliminate all completeness issues. And then we define the route, we define a starting point, an end point, and we use the old data sets from 2014 to 2019 to plan the route and try to implement that in the 2020 data set. And we just looked what happened. So we had 500 of those routes. The obvious thing happened. The older the data set was, the more the travel time increased. It was not dramatic. So if we have the 6-year-old data set, we have approximately 1.5% extension in the travel time. That's not really problematic. Usual reason was a speed limit change. So the 2014 data set said it is 50 kilometers an hour allowed, but they changed it to 30. Yeah, so it takes you longer to get there. The problematic parts were where we could not implement the route. So we got stuck. For example, one-way streets were turned around, or there were turn restrictions. And already when the data set was 1 year old, we had 8 cases out of the 500 where this happened. And this means you cannot follow the instruction. We all know what we then do. We move where we're allowed to move and wait until the navigation device tells us something new. But it is a problem, and we definitely get bad decisions. And when the data set was 5 years old, it was already 13 of 500 cases where this happened. So is this a problem? Not in navigation. We perform the task often enough. We know how to handle these situations. Worst case, we stop and ask somebody on the street for some help. But what about decisions that are less frequent? For example, selecting a university to study. You do that, I don't know, 3 times a life, probably not much more often. What about selecting a location to buy a house or build a house? You do that how often? Once a lifetime, twice a lifetime. Or it could even be worse. You have to plan a humanitarian transportation in a hazardous area. You rely on information about security along the different roads. If this is incorrect, outdated, whatever, in the best case, you lose the cargo. So we do have real situations where statistics does not necessarily help us. I have no solution for that, but we need to find solutions for that. We need to be aware of the problem. So statistics is a good abstraction for making strategic decisions. So if we have something that's on a large scale, or decisions that are made often, then statistics is a good assessment in how many cases will you be in the at least close to the optimum. But statistics is not always helpful when we deal with a concrete situation. We have an important decision, and we do that decision only once or twice a lifetime, or in general, not very often. So that was what I wanted to talk about. So thanks for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you for your very nice presentations, and very important issue that what is statistics and semantic information, which may be used in a statistical analysis, and type of interpretation of the results, and whether this statistical data quality describes the reality or not, what is the difference, and also using the old data for navigation and impact of the age of data. And when the statistics gives good results, when we're dealing with either concrete situations or not, there are the very important questions that needs further investigations. And now we have time for a couple of questions from the panelists.
I can ask a question, Mahmoud, if you like.
Yes, sure.
When all the work on spatial statistics started, Gerhard, I have, of course, a question to you. everyone was saying you can never do statistics with spatial data because you can never replicate. And we also saw that coming back when we saw the example of Mike in his first presentation. Now you say that some things cannot be done in terms of spatial statistics. Well, my view is slightly more optimistic. I would say give it a try and see how far you get. And it may open a new domain, a new realm of at least one very nice publication.
Yeah, we can, so we should give it a try, definitely. I think one of the problems is that there are decisions that are important and important enough that we should not just rely on abstract measures like statistics only. We need additional sources to assess the quality of the result. So we need more ideas. And I think it was Gary Hunter who found out that decision which data set to use was, is it from Ordnance Survey? Then I use it because they are good. I think that's something that we use a lot, this concept. I'm not sure if it's realistic to do that. I think we need more concepts that are applicable by ordinary people, not just by us experts, but by ordinary people, and that help us to get the right data and assess the usability and suitability of the data sets.
So, well, of course, you shouldn't only rely on statistics. I fully agree on that part of the story. And more context is always usable, in particular if you have very rare events. But in terms of rare events, there's also some theory behind it. What a lot of statistics tries to do is always out of conceptual thinking, try to extract the data, and on the basis of that data come to some conclusion and use as much information as possible. You see that coming back time and again. And Mike has pointed us to some of the problems that may emerge because you can draw the wrong conclusion at some moment because you have too biased a view. But if you make that open enough, I trust that a lot of these problems can also be overcome. Mike, what's your feeling on that?
Okay. Actually, I have one question myself. I would like to ask it's a good child that as we go along, we see there is a shift in the tendency of the users to use different data quality measures. For example, sometimes kappa statistics was a very good quality measure, but now after some time, Professor Pointes has wrote a paper on the depth to kappa, and he gives some reasoning that kappa is no longer a valid data quality measure. What do you think about this, and which quality parameter is most suited, in your opinion, and which can give enough statistical justifications? And because most of the quality indicators we have are called hard statistics. They are not location specific, and they consider some views and some aspects of the data and the models, but will not consider the whole aspect of the analysis. If we want to select the proper data quality parameters, what information we should use and how to select them.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're touching on a very important point here. I think that historically, many of the roots of GI stem from cartography, and they stem from a practice of trying to produce data which is good for all purposes. And our difficulty then is assessing the quality of data, not for all purposes, but for specific purposes. So this is a very dramatic change in tradition. To use the terms of computer science, everything really depends on the use case. It depends on the application for which the data are being applied. And the solution to your question of which measure of data quality to use, again, depends on the specific application. So I believe there are no general answers to your question. I believe that in certain circumstances, kappa is a useful measure, but it depends entirely on the particular application. So I think it's very important for us to emphasize that what really matters in data quality is the suitability of the data for a particular application. And the answer is always that for some applications, these data are adequate. For other applications, they're not. And unless we can get into that mindset, get away from the mindset that there was always a single measure of data quality, then I think if we can get to that point, we will make serious progress. So I think we are in a transition from a tradition which emphasized producing generic data for all purposes to a solution in which data are produced for specific purposes and quality is measured against those specific purposes.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a good job. One question from Professor Alfred Stein is that when you reviewed the history of the publications on the spatial data quality, we will see a shift from the perspective of users and producers. There is a gap between these two. For example, when we go to the big data analytics, some people from computer science believe that when we handle big data, the system automatically will correct or make some quality measures on the data, and the need for quality assessment will be reduced, and it will be handled mostly by machines. What do you think about this trend of data quality publications, and in terms of the books, journal papers, what directions we will see in this area for publications in the near futures?
Okay, I think that's a very interesting question. Thank you, Mahmoud, for raising the issue. I think that in the most important part is and remains development of the domain. And the domain, in this case, either spatial statistics or spatial data quality, it largely develops, in fact, on its own, on curiosity. That's one driver. The second driver is the questions from outside, which means the user questions. They will drive a lot. And the third drive is the new opportunities that arise. So we have different drivers. Let me keep to the three. Maybe there are more. I just did it by head. But these are three important drivers that help to develop further. Whether it is the big data and the user question that are most determinant, I don't think so. I think what has generated a lot of interest is the COVID situation, and not only in terms of publication, but in terms of science in total. People are suddenly aware of thousands of issues, from dreaming about COVID as a kind of a sociological study to a very strong epidemiological study on what was the cause of where was the cause of the disease. Still a fascinating question, by the way. But these are major drivers in the field. So the drivers that I see is the field itself, the domain. What tools do we have available that were not there 5 years ago, but there are now? 10 years ago, when I started my work, I was almost calculating the variogram by hand. Now, that's ridiculous, of course. And now we do it all automatically. But still, the big data story in terms of geostatistics is a challenge. It's not solved simply because you have so many distances to consider. You can make steps, and small steps are being made, so that will be a direction to further follow. But what I said earlier, I think the major driver for me is the questions from outside. The world outside is, for me, the most interesting one. And that is something that we always look at when papers come in for the journal. Is there a good application? Can you solve problems from outside? Or is a problem being solved with the data? So simulation studies are not so exciting. They can be important, but they're less exciting. Whereas the real problems from outside, they are, for a scientist, I would say the most fascinating things to address. The issues that Gerhard raised, I think they're fascinating. I would love to jump on those and see whether we cannot make steps in that direction.
Okay, thank you very much, Alfred. One question from Gerard Navratil is that actually for a long time we discussed about the impact or quality of the data and its effect on the decision-making process, which you have also emphasized today. From the time when Professor Borrow has talked about intelligent GIS, and also Professor Hugh Welling work on data uncertainty engine. And I know that in your working group in the University of Vienna, you and Professor Frank has some work on this decision quality. How do you think that what we have achieved through this intelligent GIS and data quality and decision quality, and how far we should go, and what steps we still need in order to find out the real impact of quality on decisions?
I think what we need to find out is if we raise the right questions, if we ask for an optimal solution. Because I think we have to be risk aware. We have to be aware that some information might be missing, some information that we use might be misleading. But the problem currently is that such systems are, first of all, not very easy to understand for outsiders. And it's, yeah, the people in the street should be able to use such a system. And the second question is, how do we really assess that things might be missing? So the typical case would be, I want to build a house somewhere and I do not know what's below the ground. There was illegal waste dump there, for example, which would be a serious effect. We had situations like that in the past. How do you assess that risk in a risk-aware GIS? We need to find the right way to deal with these kinds of situations. So we should look at probably different optimization functions. Currently, we try to take one or two parameters that we are trying to optimize. Everything, the more parameters we have, the more problems we get with this, weighting between them. Risk is another parameter. So how do we include that? How do we balance the risk that something is missing to, for example, the costs of a decision, or the value that we get out of a decision? I think we should consider these aspects, and once we figure out how we can do that, we can try to ask the question, how can we communicate that to the people? Because I think this is two questions, and both are critical and both are not very easy. Does that answer your question?
Thank you very much. And I think we have a couple of questions from the audience. We have 7 questions. I think the number 2 is from Mr. Mohammad Reza Malik. Is asked from Gerhard to answer the question regarding the tools to handle or use the models uncertainty, statistics like fuzzy logic, rough set theory, regarding the examples of transportation. How can the risk parameters can give more precise solutions to this?
I think Monte Carlo simulation would be a reasonable approach. Unfortunately, it takes quite a while to calculate the result. So we could take risk as one of the additional parameters and, for example, look for the route where the risk is the lowest in comparison to, say, the loss of travel time. So we need to merge the optimum, and the risks that we take with this solution. And I think that joining those two perspectives can lead to better solutions.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Muhammad Javad Abedini has asked about generalization in geostatistics. Is there any crack in geostatistics? Let me be more specific. Given a set of spatial data, can we make a decision on the best model beforehand?
Also to me or to Alfred?
I think it would be either from Alfred or mine.
No, let me give me a try. The word
Yes.
generalization is a very general term, and it's a hard one. Geostatistics is able to make average values, or bring data to an what I may call a larger scale level. That means larger areas. In that sense, you can do something, but that is for the moment purely based on data. If it goes to different concepts, if you want to make the forest out of the trees, so making it more semantic, I think there's still a challenge to go. There must be methods that do it, but giving a different meaning to data, that is a challenge. Yeah, and if that's the story behind the generalization question, then I think we still have some work to do.
Okay, thank you. One question from Professor Goodchild about, do you think the pervasiveness of geodata and VGI is increasing ethical dilemmas and challenges?
Yes, I think several of the ethical challenges that I presented in my second slide relate directly to VGI. There is, of course, the ethical issue of accuracy. Whether people are deliberately subverting the process of creating VGI by creating false information. That's something that I've written about, others have written about, in terms of guarding VGI systems against false information. That's one. I think the equity issue is critical. It's very easy to make the case that VGI is always biased because it depends on the willingness of people to create information, and that's not uniformly distributed across the population. So there will always be bias. And also it's involving human subjects, and so it's involving issues perhaps of privacy, confidentiality. And so yes, there are many, many issues, as there always are when any activity involves humans, because of all the complexities of human society. We've grown accustomed to a field of GI, which was originally grounded in science, led by people like Peter Burrow. And it's taken us a long time to realize that that approach didn't necessarily accommodate humans. It didn't necessarily accommodate the way humans think. And this has led, of course, to the place versus space duality. But at the same time, it inevitably raises ethical issues. So yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. And one more question from Gerhard, that when you discussed, you showed that if you navigate between 1 to 4 a.m., about 60% of people are frequently using north-south road, but we just recommend the north side at the same time of the day. Based on this result, we may create some traffic jam. Do you think that in this situation, the optimal navigation can be done randomly?
So first of all, if you start one in the next parallel road to the south, it may be reversed. So the percentages may reverse. So um, we get the spatial variation of the optimal routes just by moving start and end point. But on the other hand, I assume that the traffic planners would like us to use specific roads more than others. So they want us to use the main roads to keep the local roads more quiet. So with some respect, I assume that this is intentional. We should use more or less the same routes, all of us. And it could be an interesting solution to provide the three best and distinct routes and ask the user to select which one he or she would like to take. The question is, do you always want to see three routes at the beginning and say, I take the first or the second or the third? I would assume that usually would say, okay, just take the fastest one. And mathematically speaking, there will always be one which is the fastest one, and the second fastest is not the optimum. So it might be difficult to randomly select a suboptimal route without driving too far of a detour.
Okay, thank you. One more question from Gerhard that Mr. Malik has asked, can we interpret your presentation considering this sentence that statistics is useful when we are working in the interval or ratio level of measurement?
At least with those kinds of measurement scales, it's okay to use statistics. If you're in the nominal scale, you're not even allowed to do it. Yes, of course, we have to have these kinds of scales, of measurement scales. But the question is always, do the numbers that we calculate with statistics really describe what we have to deal with? And we have to look at what kinds of parameters should we look at and how do we calculate them?
Thank you. One question from Mr. Moshtaba Askarzadeh is asked about the validity of Tabler's law, which says everything is correlated with everything, but the nearer things are more correlated. What do you think about the validity of this Tabler law, if any one of the panelists would like to answer?
Oh, Mike, that's one for you. He was your colleague.
Well, it's not a law in the sense that a physicist would understand the term law, because it's not deterministic. It's a tendency. And so it's a tendency that is often treated by statistical methods. Geostatistics, of course, is founded almost entirely on the principle. It's also a very useful principle. I think the way I usually talk about validity is through a counterfactual argument. Imagine it was not true. Imagine a world in which either things are spatially independent or, in fact, in which the reverse is true. And based on those possibilities, it's easy to make the case that the reverse cannot be true. It's impossible for there to be negative spatial autocorrelation at all scales. And if instead there was no tendency, if things were independent, then again, it would be extremely difficult for the world to operate. So I think the answer to the question is simply to recognize that it is a tendency. And it's a particular kind of tendency. If you want to talk about spatial autocorrelation, it's a tendency to positive spatial autocorrelation. That's not to say that there can't be exceptions. And one of the most useful things about Tobler's first law is that it makes exceptions obvious. It makes anomalies clear. It's easy to identify hotspots and cold spots where things are not in accordance with Tobler's first law. And that, in many ways, leads to additional questions. So we expect it to be largely true. We expect it, therefore, to expose exceptions. And we, I think, find it useful to investigate those exceptions.
Okay, thank you very much. I have one more question from the panelists. Yes, there is one question from Professor Stein that says that I would like to see the idea of looking at opportunities to produce academic material in SDQ from problems presented by the outside world. How does one go about exploring these issues in SDQ space? Alfred, the question is for you.
Oh, could you? Yeah, I was listening, but I didn't fully grasp the point. Could you? What was the essence of the question?
In the question and answer section, if you see, it says that the idea of opportunities to produce academic materials in SDQ from problems presented by the outside world. How does one go about exploring these issues in SDQ space? The question is not very clear.
No, but I see the point. If you have a problem in the quality of your spatial data, how do you proceed with that question? Yeah, the way ahead is for me always first try to formulate an objective. What do you want to achieve and which way do you want to go? And the second one is to try to formulate an hypothesis. In statistics, we always have our statistical, but it doesn't need to be statistical in that sense. But what do you hypothesize? So what do you think is the cause? And that's, of course, the biased view that you have to be careful about. But that brings us to the next level. And then you may start collecting data that somehow could at some moment violate or not violate this hypothesis. So you start with the problem, you try to bring it back to something that is digestible, you try to formulate an hypothesis that could be true, could be false, so something that you really want to research. You can bring it down to research questions, a few if you like, and then start collecting the data, or if you already have the data, use the data to whatever way you can try to answer that question. It's a bit critical because data, and I agree on that, are usually collected for a specific purpose, but there are also data that are of, let's say, more general quality, which you can maybe use for that particular purpose. So that would be, for me, the way. And then at some moment, let's not underestimate that part of the story. There should be the reflection, and that reflection is a very critical part of the whole story. Reflect upon what you have achieved. Is this valuable? Do we have now the whole story or only a part of the story? What is now, in fact, in hindsight, the question that we have answered? Is that the real question as it was thought about and formulated at the start? So that requires a few more steps along the line. But that reflection stage is, for me, also a very important one.
Thank you very much. The other question is asked by Mr. Martin Rutzinger from Professor Goodchild. He asked about the ethical issues in GIS when we use artificial intelligence method, because internal processes are mostly black box. And what would be the ethical issues when dealing with artificial intelligence?
And there right away is the first, which is that it is black box. So in science, typically, we believe strongly in replicability. We believe that every scientific result should be published with sufficient detail to allow someone else to reproduce the result. And that becomes extremely difficult in AI. Because in AI, The details of the solution are not necessarily transparent to the user and are difficult to transfer. So imagine trying to publish a result from AI without publishing the entire structure of the computational network. It's very difficult to imagine. I've just published a paper in PNAS on reproducibility, replicability across space and time. And one of the conclusions we reach is that in the case of AI, and specifically geo AI, it's impossible to imagine the result of a piece of science that uses geo AI being replicable. So this is an enormous problem. At another level, we've seen all kinds of issues resulting from the training process that goes on in AI, where the training process introduces bias. And so there have been a number of publications recently, a number of conferences and workshops having to do with ethical issues raised by AI. So the answer to the question is very simple. Yes, AI raises a host of ethical issues which are not necessarily raised by more conventional methods of spatial analysis.
Thank you. Another question from Professor Goodchild. It is in the same line with the previous questions from Mohammed Kaur from University of Tehran. He asked, can we use ethical issues with machine learning in which we predict the probability and evaluate the trustness of the objective answers? For example, the probability of trustness of data before further calculations.
I'm not sure I understood the question fully, but as you say, it overlaps quite strongly with the previous question. Maybe, can we try again? Could you repeat the question, perhaps?
The question is that, can we solve the ethical issues with machine learning in which we predict the probability and evaluate the trustness of objective answers? For example, set up probability for trustness of data before further calculation.
And I think, as I said, I think this raises a host of ethical issues. The great successes of AI and machine learning have been in prediction, but they've been in prediction in very limited circumstances. Ones that really don't meet the norms of science. They're not replicable, they're not reproducible. They may function well for certain purposes, commercial purposes particularly, but typically commercial purposes are not subject to peer review. They're not subject to the normal standards of science. So I think the bottom line is we have a serious issue here where AI and machine learning are becoming extremely popular in the scientific community, and yet the underlying issues have not seriously been addressed. There's a famous paper by a very well-known expert in machine learning AI, which argues that essentially AI is a very sophisticated form of curve fitting. And if you follow that argument, curve fitting has never been, in the history of science, never been a very respectable activity. So here, I think, is a cause of really quite important caution. And I deliberately didn't focus on AI in my remarks because I feel that these take all of the ethical issues to a new level.
Okay. Thank you. The next questions, I think, is from Gerhard. From Carlos Neto has asked that with the rapid advance in the collection and dissemination of information, it is currently possible to discard the use of traditional topographic equipment such as GPS to carry out field surveying and validate a municipality cartographic base or information obtained with. For example, OpenStreet is enough or not. If we want to select a data source, whether we can go for VGI or traditional surveying for municipal applications, what parameters, for example, we should take into account?
That depends heavily on the question. OpenStreetMap is a wonderful source of information on what is actually there and where is it. Where are the roads, where are houses, all that kind of stuff. What it cannot tell you, for example, is legal boundaries. So where do rights end of one person and the rights of another person start? That's not visible in the reality, so OpenStreetMap cannot tell you that. And of course, we have very specific range of spatial accuracy. So we have meter accuracy, half a meter accuracy. That's sufficient for a huge range of applications. But if you're trying to set up a railway network for high-speed trains, then meter accuracy or even centimeter accuracy may lead you nowhere. You need higher accuracy to place the railroad lines in the correct location. And for that, we will definitely need geodetic measurement equipment, and we need more accurate sources than most of the VGI can provide us. So it mainly depends on the questions that you have and the applications.
Okay, thank you very much. I think another questions from Mr. Abedini. How to assess the following sentence: stationarity is the property of the data and not the model. What do you think?
Also me?
Maybe Alfred?
Well, there's always a balance between the two. Yeah, it's a bit an open door. Sparse models are usually very relatively simplistic and well understandable. You can easily follow them, and you can easily explain them. More complicated models can be more complete. They can be, but they can be harder to explain. Usually, the simple models don't require that many data, so the data balance is usually in favor of the simpler model. Let's say simple regression model. The complicated one may require lots and lots and lots of data, increasing the uncertainties, but maybe more precise in terms of the process that you want to address. So yeah, it depends very much on what you want to do. What's the target? What do you want to achieve? Is it something? Maybe in the case of Gerhard, a relatively simple answer to a rather complicated question. Then the sparse model can be excellent and can be good for the purpose. But if you are a good scientist, let's say we're all good scientists, but if you have a very deep scientific question, I can imagine that you have a very, very complicated model. I've seen once a model that was describing a simple pea. Well, you know, the pea, these little fruits, and it has the growth of a pea, and it has thousands and thousands of lines of code. Now, do we want to have this type of models? Yeah, fine, but you usually also need a lot of data to fill that model properly, and then in the end you may ask yourself, yes, so what? So yeah, that question you should maybe phrase up front. What do you want to achieve with your analysis? A lot of data with a very simplistic model is usually not much use. Few data with a very complicated model is also usually not much use. So there is a kind of a combination between the two. Simple models, less data, and more complicated model, more data. But maybe I'm too simplistic in this attitude.
Okay, thank you.
But I think maybe Mike has something to add. I see him scratching his head. He must have something smart.
Yes.
No, I'm dreaming about breakfast.
Okay. My dinner is upcoming.
Okay, I think actually we had 2 hours discussion about, and but still there are some questions. We can either send these questions to the panelists and gives their answers through email communication, or if you like to answer these 2 questions. One question from Professor Goodchild on the ethical issues in making references from spatial data about the unconsciousness bias and subjectivity always influence our perspective. This is true even for very rational and passionate analysis. Professor Goodchild, could you comment on these questions from Chakua Okolai?
Yes, and I think that's very much in line with what I was saying. That when we think about topics such as environmental justice, it's very easy to become biased, either by past practices or by cultural assumptions. And this whole questioning of ethics, the new dimensions to ethics, which were really the focus of my talk, are all leading us in a particular direction. They're leading us to a greater attention to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, in addition to what we have traditionally done, which is to regard the scientific process as objective, independent of the investigator, and certainly these are issues which are of critical importance in any kind of spatial analysis.
Thank you. And one question from Mr. Malik, he asked from Gerhard that in your presentations, the example you have given in transportation, if you use statistics such as fuzzy logic or rough set theory, should we add some other parameters like risk parameters in order to model the transportation issues?
Yeah, I was trying to answer that question before already. Having the risk as an additional parameter might be a good solution, but we then have to think about how do we merge the parameter that we want to optimize with the parameter of risk, and how do we balance those? And that could be an interesting question that, yeah, in the past we were not too successful with coming up with reasonable weights for different parameters. So it's always, we can always ask for various balances. How much is it worth to get a hotel closer to the beach? So you either pay with money or with travel time. It could be a solution, but we may run into a completely different problem.
Thank you very much. Some of the items have asked about the possibility to have access to the presentations. I think the presentations will be has been recorded, and it will be provided by ISPRS through YouTube or some other media, but I think it will be announced after the webinar how can access to the presentations. So if there is any point left the panelists would like to discuss or conclude, yes, we can have a very short time for this final conclusions. Any points the panelists would like to raise at the end of the webinar?
Thanks for organizing, Mahmoud, and thanks for the audience of attending and being there. It's fantastic to have some 100 attendance on this webinar. Good stuff. Well done. Congratulations.
Yes, well done.
Same
Okay.
from me.
Please join me to thank all the panelists and speakers in this session. And also I would like to thank the ISPS Commission for President, Professor Zelaton Nava, to organize this set of webinars in the Commission and give us the opportunity to have this webinar, and also the ISPRS Council. Yes, please. I see you all.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your
Bye.
attendance. Bye. Bye.